Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Today we thought we would talk about pets, specifically dogs. There are many owners out there of dogs, and they discover that companion dogs are certainly the best. While we experience something that is non-judgmental, seems to be a good listener after a tough day at the office, good at motivating us humans to get off the couch, there are many benefits of having these canine companions in our lives. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who's going to be talking about the latest research in canine science and provide many practical ways that allows dogs to exercise their senses, which in addition to exercising their brains and muscles, will also reveal what smell, taste, touch, sight, and hearing mean to dogs in ways of enhancing a dog's freedom in safe, mutually happy ways to unleash them. The title of his book is Unleashing Your Dog, a field guide to giving your canine companion the best life possible. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mark Bekoff. Mark, thank you for being on the program today.
Oh, you bet. Thank you for having me, and I'm sure all the dogs who are listening will be thankful, too.
For all the dogs in the world. I remember many years ago we had a sponsor for our radio program, and it was a dog food company, and it was really funny to see their television commercial. You know, to the dogs of the world, we truly want to say that we're sorry, because his attitude about dog food was to move in the direction of being more raw, what dogs actually would typically find in nature. And it was based not just on that, but just on reason that that's exactly how we feed our dog. I actually go to the store and buy ingredients and things that we normally would get as raw and as simple as possible.
Right.
And I used to have a lot of fun with that because when I would show my wife, this is our dog we have now is actually her first dog. And I would go into the office after making his food with the dog dish in hand and say, here, you want to try some of his food? Maybe a little bit of rice, a little bit of slightly cooked beef cubes, things like that. Mm-hmm. And I'd eat it right out of his dish. She was like, no, because it was in a dog dish. But it was the same thing we would put on our plate. Let's go ahead and address that real quick.
Yeah. Well, excuse me, 1 second.
Uh-huh. That sometimes happens when we get that processed dog food we find in cans.
Yes.
No. But that stuff smells when it comes out. I'll never do that again.
I was just coughing something. Yeah, I mean, we do have, we have a section in there called taste. And, what we're concerned with is, the sensitivity of dogs. They obviously taste and eat things that we just wouldn't even go near. And we have, discussions about feeding dogs what we put in quotes people food, and we don't know what that really means. I mean, just listening to your story, I know what people food is, but boy, when I lived with my dogs and they lived long, happy lives, they would eat a lot what we would eat, and they did really well. So, there's things that most dogs shouldn't eat, like chocolate. I had a dog who stole half of a chocolate cake and was fine. But, the best thing to do with chocolate is not to give dogs any chocolate. But my dogs like pasta. Last year there was a paper that came out that, just basically said it's perfectly okay to feed your dog pasta. So I'm a fan of making my own food and making my dog's food, and making sure that, they get what they need, basically.
So, it was, I remember there are a lot of people that actually talk about ways that you can actually make dog treats and so forth. And quite frankly, I'll raise my hand in applause because some of what some of these people talk about not only makes sense, but it's reasonable. For instance, they seem to navigate toward more of the organic. For instance, one YouTuber was saying, look in the wild, dogs are predominantly meat eaters. Now, they'll chew on grass and other things like that, but you have to think of them along those lines. And so when you actually go into, let's say, pet food stores or whether it's the regular store to buy dog food, and you see corn on the label, it's like, how many times have you seen a dog in a cornfield actually peeling an ear of corn and sitting there and really enjoying it?
Right.
It's bad enough that we're feeding our salmon, our farm-raised salmon, corn, because apparently salmon now like corn, but dogs too, really?
No. I agree with you totally on that because, dogs, domestic dogs have a very different digestive system than wolves, for example. And I get, I see ads on the TV, and I've actually had a lot of emails, some since Unleashing Your Dog came out last week, saying, something like, my goodness, if I fed the wolf and my dog, we'd have more of an obesity crisis with dogs than we have now. And that's, just another aspect of living with a dog is feeding them responsibly and being sure that you're taking care of their needs but not, overdoing it. And one of the things that I heard years ago was that, if you look at the ingredients for different crackers or different, I call them treats for humans, the only difference is that some, for the humans, get food coloring because, we want our food to be colored. Dogs don't really care.
Right.
But I tell people that. I said, when next time you go buy dog food or treats, take a look at the ingredients, and you'll probably go, oh, my goodness, I could use those same ingredients and make crackers and snacks for myself. So, yep, you are totally right about, the way you're going, if you will, on feeding your dogs.
Okay, so not that we want to spend a whole lot of time about how and what we should feed our dog. That's, like I said, I keep it basic. We actually have never, since we've had this dog, actually buy anything or a can or packaged by someone else. As I like to say to my wife, I like to know what's in it, and I'm sure he's just as happy because he wolfs it down, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But let's go ahead. First of all, go ahead and share with our listeners how you came to be in the realm of dogs, because you've written a lot of books about dogs. And anybody that goes to your website, which we'll give about, but it's markbeckoff.com, I noticed you've written several books on the subject itself. So how did all this start for you?
Well, my parents tell me that it started when I was about 2 or 3 years old, growing up in Brooklyn, New York, of all places. And I used to talk to the dogs. I used to talk to the cats and the mice and birds and insects. And as far as I can remember, I was always asking questions about what do animals think and what do they feel. And I didn't get raised with a dog. My mom had been bitten by a dog, and it wasn't like that she didn't like them. She was afraid of them. But I also grew up in a household that was pretty warm and very compassionate. And I think it just rubbed off that I was always concerned about, the well-being of animals. And when I was about 3 or 4 years old, my dad told me that I yelled at a man who was hitting his dog. And, of course, the guy took it out on my father.
No.
But I always wanted to study, I always wanted to study non-human animals. Dogs were good. And then I went on, and, I ultimately got my doctorate degree in animal behavior, focusing on the development of social behavior in dogs, coyotes, wolves, coyote-dog hybrids, and wolf-dog hybrids. And then I did a 9-year field study of coyotes living outside of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And there you go. I mean, I've been studying dogs for decades, and a lot of what I write about comes from observations of free-running dogs at dog parks, on trails, and also I've done some work on, I guess we call them free-ranging, almost feral dogs. So I think I was just destined to do this, Dave.
And certainly I've seen my share of wolf documentaries, and I think one of the more unique ones was talking about how wolves potentially became domesticated. And there was a movie that was out just about a year or so ago called Alpha, which actually explores the possibility of when this must have happened. Mm-hmm. And, which was quite a unique movie. And, but what was really unique about this particular documentary that I've seen is it talked about how for a wolf to become domesticated, it would take roughly anywhere from 6 to 8 generations before that actually happens.
Right.
And they were showing things, for instance, how in the wild a dog's tail is usually straight versus a domesticated dog which tends to curl up like a party favor. Mm-hmm. Much like a killer whale. If you go and see those in the wild, the dorsal fin is totally raised up into the air and straight. Right. In captivity, they curve. And So what they decided to do was also explore the idea of another myth, which would be, for instance, that, well, if we take a wolf puppy from the wild and we go ahead and bring him into a domesticated situation as a puppy, that perhaps imprinting will allow them to, actually become tame or domesticated. But they found out that simply just was not true, that they become more reckless in the kitchen, tearing things up and going crazy. So they had determined that it took generations of that before that sort of behavior would occur. And I found that really fascinating. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you're right. So I always say that a domesticated wolf is a dog. So I've lived with wolf puppies. I had to raise some. I've watched them in the wild. And, wolves, for example, they're social. Wolves who are raised with people often retain that bond with them for quite a long time. But they're not domesticated animals. They're still wild animals, but they're socialized. And the theories that I think are holding the most water now, one was put forth by Mark Durr in a book called How the Dog Became the Dog, is basically because of the social nature of wolves, they formed cooperative and reciprocal relationships with humans. And basically over time, humans selectively bred certain individuals for whatever traits, maybe cooperation, maybe, wolves who worked with the humans in a friendly way. And basically that's how wolves became dogs or dogs became dogs. And, there's nothing fancy about it. There's a theory out there that the dumpster theory, that wolves were stealing food from dumpsters, and that's how they became dogs. But there's really no archaeological or anthropological evidence for that. So I think the simplest one is that wolves are social. They formed social reciprocal relationships with early humans, and out came dogs.
Certainly seems reasonable enough. So now let's talk about the wolf theory of domesticated dogs that people tend to attenuate to.
So the wolf theory?
Yeah, you were talking about in your book about how sometimes, for instance, I remember reading a piece in your book when we were talking about food earlier, feed the wolf in your dog, and we certainly answered that. But what are some other behaviors people try to tie to, dogs are a lot like wolves, so therefore it should be like this?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. One would be their social affinities. There's some kind of inherent, if you will, drive among individuals who we call dogs to be social and to form affiliations. They show the very, very similar periods of socialization. I'm talking about wolves and dogs who are raised in, wolf typical and dog typical environments. But, anybody who's, rescued a dog who's been abused, for example, or, has a dog who didn't get the requisite contact with other dogs or humans knows that they don't easily form bonds later in life. So a lot of the similarities depend on dogs having, adequate interactions with humans and with other dogs. Between 3 weeks and maybe 8 or 10 weeks. People call that the socialization period. And it's true, most dogs will seek out other animals as friends, if you will, as long as they've gone through the normal period of socialization. And the behavior patterns that young wolves and young dogs perform are very similar. When I studied baby wolves and baby dogs, sometimes it was really hard to just look at the numbers, if you will, for certain behavior patterns and be able to say, oh, that was a baby wolf, that was a baby dog. So there is that similarity, and I think it just comes down to their social nature.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk about some things because living here in the Arizona area, you see a lot of people, especially with the small dogs, which it's just my bias, but sometimes those things annoy me, especially the way you see people interact with them. But it's their choice. And what's really funny is human behavior toward dogs tends to be what I would like to say projected onto the dog and personified. Does that make sense?
Yes. Dogs are often, if you will, targeted that way, and I don't mean targeted in a negative way. But, once again, there's just a lot of behavior patterns that dogs and other animals perform that are very similar, if you will, to patterns of behavior, that people perform. They do them differently, but, so in a very generic sense, you'll have dogs greeting one another in the way dogs greet one another. And, Lord knows we don't greet other people that way, nor do we greet dogs the way they greet dogs. But people talk about what's called anthropomorphism, projecting human traits on non-human animals, for example. And I don't really worry about that because my research and the research of others, and, we write a lot about it in our book, talks about the emotional lives of dogs, that they can love, they can form relationships that aren't very friendly, they grieve, they mourn. There's some really good evidence that, they get jealous. Guilt is the emotion that comes up a lot, and it's often mistakenly said that dogs don't feel guilt. And people are talking about an experiment done by Dr. Alexandra Horowitz at Barnard, who's also an author on dogs. And all Alexandra found was that we're not good at reading guilty faces and guilty postures, if you will, and gestures. But she didn't say that they don't experience guilt. So I don't worry about the anthropomorphism. I mean, we've got data coming in now on doing magnetic resonance imaging on dogs that show that in certain emotional states, the same part of the dog's brain lights up as human brains. So we do project certain things. I mean, you might also be talking, like in my book, Canine Confidential, that came out last year, sometimes I'd be at dog parks and people would go, I have no idea why Mary or Harry, dogs do this. And what I really want to say is, oh, have you looked in the mirror recently?
Right.
But I don't. But, once again, you get a young dog or even an older dog, but, with a young dog, it's much easier to do. You basically bring them into your house. You're treating them in a certain way. They're getting used to your patterns of behavior. You're getting used to their patterns of behavior. And it's not surprising they would pick up certain, they would routines, or they would pick up on certain patterns of behavior and, would know, oh, I'm being walked now, or I'm being fed now, or, oh, I just did something that Mark doesn't really like, or something like that. We're not projecting human traits onto them. In fact, that's ample research has shown, that's what they know and that's what they feel.
Mm-hmm. When I was thinking about, as you were describing all that, for instance, the idea that when you were writing in your book about, do dogs feel guilty, for instance, if they chew up your shoes? So is it possible that they do feel guilt, or they just kind of do it and whatever? Why I ask that is, I remember years ago I had a dog, and she was really an interesting character because we were obviously real close, and it was sad that at one point I decided to give her away to somebody, and that's something I know I'd never do again. But that being said, it was funny because one of the things back in the day, this was 30 plus years ago, that I would like thumbing through would of course be the TV guide. And from time to time, I would find the TV guide shredded, but in a pile that was right next to an area of the couch that I usually sat on. And I kind of wondered about that, or, it'd usually be, just things that I would probably eventually throw away. But she would just chew these things up, but leave them in neat little piles in an area that I typically was in. What would be your interpretation of something like that?
I really don't know.
Yeah, but just take a guess.
Yeah. One interpretation was that, it's just coincidental. She was having fun. She really got into ripping something up. The other was, you could go really far and say, well, she was leaving you a present. She doesn't necessarily, without being, without being punished or praised, she or other dogs might not know that they've done something wrong or they've done something that would please you, because I have stories, and all the dogs I lived with, sometimes they'd be really proud that they did something, and they'd be prancing around carrying something in their mouth to show Mark how skilled they were or something like that. But your question about guilt is a good one because we just don't know. Do I feel that dogs feel guilt? I do. The proper studies have not been done. But that's my take. There's no reason to believe that dogs don't have the capacity to feel guilt. We just haven't studied it yet. But if somebody said to me, what would be your hypothesis if you did a study, I would say that the hypothesis would be that they feel guilt. And a great example we write about in the book, too, is the question, do dogs feel jealousy? And for years, people weighed in, of course they do, or of course they don't. And even 2 years ago, there was an article written that says, scientific research shows that dogs don't feel jealous. But in fact, scientific research in a really cool study has shown that dogs do. What these people did was they took pre-linguistic kids, really young kids, and set up a situation where the kids would feel jealous, say, another kid got an object that, they wanted. But the kids can't speak and say, oh, yes, I felt jealous. So they look at the behavior of the kids and they make, if you will, the strong inference that the kid felt jealous. They use the exact same procedure on dogs and saw the exact same patterns of behavior. But it was taken one step further. Gregory Burns, who's at Emory University, is well known these days for doing fMRIs, magnetic resonance imaging on dog brains. He set up a situation just last year where he had dogs in the MRI and set up a situation where one dog was getting a treat and that dog wasn't. The same parts of the dog brain lit up in that situation as light up in human brains when adult humans or linguistic humans can just say, I'm feeling jealous. So my take is that if we could set up a situation like that, which wouldn't be that hard to set up, I think we would find that the same parts of a dog brain light up as a human brain when they feel guilt. The other thing a lot of people just don't think about or realize is that dogs are mammals. We're mammals. Chimpanzees are mammals. Elephants are mammals. And we all share the exact same parts of the brain that underlie our emotions in the limbic system.
Well, that would certainly make sense because, again, when you take a look at the dog in the wild, even if it's a domesticated dog, they tend to form groups. They may not run around in packs, but they're basically social creatures.
Exactly.
And so they depend on those kind of social behaviors for survival, really. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, once again, it's just interesting. I mean, what you just said is exactly what I usually say is, look, you have situations, you look at wild animals and people are just, so freely attribute different emotional states, cognitive abilities, intelligence, if you will. But something went wrong with dogs over time. I think part of it comes to the human-dog bond where I've had people say, I know my dog gets lonely. I know my dog gets jealous. But it's hard for me to accept that because when you attribute these, cognitive and emotional capacities, it means that you've got even more responsibility to give these dogs the very best life you can. And we write about that, in the book that, you got animals who are really smart. They're sentient, if we call it sentient. They're conscious, and they're feeling beings. So that ups the ante. And we just really need to accept the fact that they care very much about how we treat them, and they can read when things are not going right. They feel it just like we do.
Now, let's talk about exercise. There's a lot of people out there that feels that people need to take their dogs out for regular exercise. But you talk about exercise isn't just so much physical, but also sensory as well.
Right. We write about, for example, if dogs have to exercise their nose, that, when dogs are free to sniff, they sniff about a third of the time. And, so I have a story in there about a woman at a dog park. She was really serious about it, and she made me really think about it, that when dogs aren't allowed to sniff, it's a form of sensory deprivation, like we might feel when we're not allowed to look at something or exercise, if you will, our senses. So we formed the book around the five senses, and it was really exciting to do. It's like, dogs need to be able to see things. They have a very different visual system than we do. They have a very different auditory system than we do in terms of what they can hear, for example. So what we are pushing is that, dogs need physical exercise. We also mention, of course, that there can be far too much of a good thing living around Boulder, Colorado, which is a great outdoor town. Some veterinarians have told me repeatedly that they'll see young dogs who are just worn to the bone, if you will, because people want to take them on, 10K runs or 5-mile runs. And I have people ask me that all the time.
Dogs have actually created those kind of events for themselves. I guess we just missed that, right?
Yes, exactly. And what I always say is, dogs, young dogs, like young human babies and young chimpanzees, they need to put a lot of energy into growth and maintenance. And, they're not designed, if you will, to run 5 miles on pavement, especially as youngsters. So, the exercise, the physical exercise part is usually pretty easy to deal with. They get aerobic and anaerobic training. They'll run for a long time, or they'll do, especially when they play and they engage in what we call these zoomies, where they're just going frantically crazy at a dog park. Stop, do it again. They're getting, some anaerobic training. But people need to realize that dogs really need to exercise their senses. They need to know what their senses, the different, if you will, characteristics of, their visual or olfactory, auditory system is. And that's why I always, when I lived with my dogs, I was fortunate enough to live with them in the mountains outside of Boulder, and I could play games with them. I could bury food all over my land and, challenge them, and they would have to watch me sometimes. They'd have to hear something. They'd have to sniff something, and they loved it. So once again, I tell people, you can enrich your dog's life by making them work for food, for example, or sniff something out.
I know when you talk about play in the book, too, about taking your dog to a dog park, for instance. I remember the first time we took our current dog out to a dog park. He didn't seem rather interested in hanging out with other dogs. I mean, from time to time he might check something out, but for the most part what was funny about him in this rather large dog park is that he spent more time sniffing along the fence line. And it became kind of humorous to us. But apparently, as you were writing, that sometimes people actually get very upset when their dogs don't play with other dogs. Is that true?
They do, and they don't realize that, another main message in that book, in my book Canine Confidential, is all dogs are individuals, and you know this because you've lived with them. And so there are dogs who don't play. So, for example, 2 dogs who I rescued, I don't know much about their early life, but they were not players for a while, and it just took them a while to get accustomed to either going to a dog park or meeting the other dogs on our mountain road. So most dogs, I always say many dogs, maybe most dogs like to play, but if your dog doesn't like to play, accept the fact that they're an individual, try to figure out perhaps why, and it might be because they had a bad experience when they were young. And then to me the challenge has always been, and I know people who I've talked to, is let your dog do what they want to do. Take them to a dog park or, and let them interact with people, let them, sniff around the periphery, And a lot of the times, I've never really studied it, so I don't have any numbers, but I've had tons of stories where people go, it took Jerome about 2 months to warm up, and now he won't stop playing. Or, Mary just had to sniff around and get comfortable, because one of the things that's important about play is that dogs, like other non-humans and human animals, don't play unless they're in what we call a relaxed field and they feel comfortable. So, maybe it's just too much. Maybe they've exercised their nose too much when they go to a dog park and there's too many strange odors and they're uncomfortable. So your observations are great, and people could use those to accept the fact that their dog is an individual, and then accept, or try to figure out how they can accommodate what their dog wants and needs, so ultimately the dog will enjoy being somewhere.
Yeah, because as I was mentioning earlier about especially people who own those little dogs, it could be a wide variety of breeds, and that's fine if you want to own those kind of dogs. But the fact is that you see, and you can actually get to know quite a bit about a person themselves.
Yeah.
By what comes out of their mouth as they're holding their basically spoiled little animal. And that's, for instance, it's like those little shivering chihuahuas you see women walking around with most of the time. It's usually a woman that's walking around with them, and they never walk. They're always shivering, like they're either freezing to death or they're so nervous that they can't seem to settle down. And then they talk about, she just doesn't like when this happens, and this and that and the other. And I said, well, the truth is you're really telling me about what you don't like. It isn't about the dog. I mean, what are you, a mind reader?
No, you're right. I steer clear of that just because it can get highly personal.
Sure it can. I get it. It's more from the humorous aspect of observation than anything. There's not. It's just how people are. But you do cover hugging though. See, and dogs love hugs. But I kind of agree with what you actually say in the book about that. About if they feel comfortable with it. But go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, last year, I guess it could have been, or maybe 2 years ago, there was an article in the New York Times that basically concluded that don't hug your dog. And it was based on some research, and it was based on stories this reporter had heard. And I was getting emails. Just my inbox was full. Like, did you see this blankety-blank article? What do you think? And I thought, well, if your dog likes to be hugged, hug them, just like people. And if your dog doesn't like to be hugged, don't hug them. And last year I gave a talk in Boulder, Colorado, where I live, and a woman came up afterwards and said, thank you for what you just said. I read this article, and I stopped hugging my dog, and I could tell that it was really affecting her, that, I wasn't being affectionate. And probably what was going on in her dog brain is like, what's going on here? You used to touch me. Dogs respond to touch in the same neurophysiological way as humans do. So bottom line is, if your dog likes to be hugged, hug them. And if you get the sense that your dog doesn't like to be hugged, don't hug them. And maybe you could work out a way to, it's like the non-playing dogs. Maybe you can work out a way so that your dog feels safe when you hug them. And once again, I have numerous stories where people have said, thanks for that. I tried to hug my dog. They would run away or they'd shake and be nervous, and I kept trying to do it rather than doing it slowly. And then the dog, dogs want to feel safe. And then the dog felt safe, and now they're huggers. It's the same thing when people say, when I write about dog parks, some people write back and go, dog parks are horrible. Well, surely not all dog parks are horrible, but a lot of it comes from a person has a bad experience with their dog, or they have a bad experience with another dog. So once again, my bumper sticker is, if your dog likes a dog park, then go, but don't use the dog park to socialize with other people and ignore your dog. And if your dog doesn't like the dog park, don't go. And I have a story. I don't think it's in this book. It's in Canine Confidential, of a guy who said, I love dog parks. My dogs don't like it, but I still come, and my dog shivers all the time or, goes crazy in the car and not wanting to go. What should I do? And I always say, well, you should go to the dog park and leave your dog at home.
Yeah, leave your dog behind, absolutely.
Yeah, but, and I laugh about it, but this guy was really sincere, but I said, well, how would you like it if somebody knew that you didn't like to go to a certain movie or a restaurant, and they dragged you there, which is basically what he had to do, and he said, I wouldn't like it. I said, your dog, what you've described to me about your dog's behavior indicates clearly that they don't like it. So once again, and then he went on, saying, oh, but, he's a dog. He should love the dog park. And I'm saying, well, that's like saying all humans should have the same preferences for things, which is not true. I'm glad we got into this discussion because sometimes I get these emails from people and they feel so badly. Oh, there's something wrong with my dog. She won't play. There's something wrong with my dog. She doesn't like going to the dog park. There's something wrong with my dog. He doesn't like everybody. And another message that we give out clear is that dogs are not unconditional lovers. And we're not necessarily their best friends. I mean, if we were their best friends, in a very royal, human way, you wouldn't have all the abuse that we have of dogs.
And I know, it's heartbreaking, too, when you're watching a television program and all of a sudden one of those commercials come up and you see these animals. And quite frankly, that's pretty bad to watch. But actually, there are situations that are much, much worse that maybe we've never seen before. And
yes,
that just breaks my heart. It's the same way with children. And I know that especially as we've been producing this show now going on close to 20 years now, that we talk about how when parents, the children, the empty nest syndrome, so forth, they tend to get a dog and the dog becomes their surrogate child.
Yes.
And there's a lot of truth to that kind of relationship, that because
yep.
You even talked about a study in Great Britain where they actually appointed an ambassador for human loneliness, and I was like kind of surprised by that. But one of the things that can help any human, and it actually has improved many lives, especially with post-traumatic stress disorder, they realize a dog is a fantastic companion, and I use the word companion because it's a mutual beneficial relationship. It's of
yes.
an equal relationship, and I think too many times the message out there is the dog, and it may start with religion back in the old days, that the animals were inferior and we're the stewards of the earth, and I think people misinterpreted that message. What they should have been realizing is what they were saying maybe wisely in the Bible is that we have the potential to destroy this thing, and it's in stewarding ourselves and respecting what is in front of us, that's what we steward. Mm-hmm. And I think too many times, for instance, one story I was sharing with my wife today was I remember in a restaurant looking out on the waterfront, there was a walkway that a lot of people would walk their dogs or jog or do whatever. And I noticed this lady walking along with a dog on a leash, and it had its nose tied pointing downward like it was breaking a horse. And I'm looking at it, I get astounded at what I see as people say, and they would call that in the name of training behavior. Like,
yes.
Would you do that to your children or to yourself, really? I mean,
yeah.
Again, we're talking about reasonable things to approach this whole subject in.
Yeah. No. You're definitely right, and a lot of it comes down to either not knowing. We write about people should become fluent in dog, for example, or dog
the
literate.
Dog whisperer, yes.
Is knowing dog behavior, and the other comes back to what I was saying before, that there's no universal dog. So when people go, oh, there's something wrong with my dog, she doesn't want to play, or there's something wrong with my dog, she doesn't like the dog park, or something like that, there's nothing wrong with your dog. That's like saying that not everybody likes vanilla ice cream. I mean, right. I don't mean that facetiously. So is there something wrong with somebody if they don't like vanilla ice cream, or they don't like something that even most other people like? And so I always say to people, when you make these general statements, you're being demeaning to your dog, really, because one of the exciting things to me about living with either one dog at a time or two dogs is how different they can be and how much we can learn about who they are by just watching them. So, I've had many dogs over the years. Some were really afraid of lightning. Some went outside in lightning. Some were afraid of, loud noises, perhaps because of the way they were treated when they were young. Some didn't mind them. And so when people, and actually in our field studies on coyotes, and I've also seen it in wild wolves, when these animals come out of the hole in the ground when they're around 3 weeks of age, you've got vastly different personalities. You wouldn't even know that they grew up in the same hole and had the same mother and father. And so individual differences are critical, and that comes back to some of what we were talking about in terms of, exercising your senses. Some dogs may want to be able to sniff more than they're allowed. Some might be upset if they can't see things. And some might be upset if they don't get to play with their buddies every day.
Now, here's the other, and it's good that you also brought up the noises, because I haven't seen a dog yet that enjoys 4th of July. I mean, that's universal as far as I've ever seen. Now, I will say that our dog now, it was funny because when we still lived up in the Northwest, they don't have, for instance, the kind of fireworks that launch in the sky and explode, at least, for sale. You can certainly go up to another state and get those, but one of the things that was really entertaining were these things, I think they're called fireballs, where it looks like a firecracker. You light it, and it turns into a little fireball and just kind of bounces around. It doesn't explode or make a real loud noise, but a kind of a fizzy noise. And he seemed rather entertained with kind of, barking at it, walking around, kind of like he was interested in going after it. But, again, I have yet to see a dog that I know of at any time in my life who enjoys 4th of July. They don't like it too much.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, once again, that's maybe one generality that seems to hold. I never had a dog who enjoyed having fireworks go off or respond, they would respond the same way perhaps to a car backfiring. So you're right about that. And we actually write about noise phobias. And the other thing we write about is, noise overload. That, I don't know, I just sometimes see dogs, in the back of a car or in the front seat of a car, and the music is on loud. Or I went to a party not too long ago, and it was a great party, and there was a lot of loud music, and the dog was frantic. And the people, I didn't know the people I was invited, kept saying, he doesn't usually do this. And I'm going, no, he probably doesn't, because you probably don't usually have the Rolling Stones at 35,000 decibels.
Now, if it was the Who, the dog might be happier, but the Rolling Stones, I can understand that.
Yes,
but, you bring me to another thing that you talk about in your book, and that is Unleashing Your Dog. The title of the book is about leaving our dogs behind when we need to go places that dogs we know they're not going to be allowed to be in. Mm-hmm. The idea of leaving a TV or a radio on. Let's talk about that, because I thought you made a pretty good point in there about whether or not we should do this.
Well, once again, it varies according to the dog, but your radio and your TV is not really a good substitute for you. I mean, so, I don't know that there's been any great studies done, but I just tell people, if you're leaving, first of all, to be quite frank with you, Dave, I just say, if your dog's going to be left alone 8 hours a day or crated 8 hours a day, then maybe you shouldn't get a dog. I mean,
right. I agree with that. Or you put it out in the back. I remember a commercial back in the 80s. Hey, where's that little dog that you used to have? Oh, he's all grown up now. He's in the backyard.
Exactly.
I'm like, oh, my God, really?
Yeah. No. So it's the same kind of thing. People will go, oh, I'm leaving for the day. I'll leave the TV on, or I'll leave the radio blasting or something like that. And sorry, but it's just not a substitute for you or another human being there. I've got some neighbors who do leave for the day, so they have dog walkers going in. And, it works. I mean, in all honesty, it works really well. I mean, they just the dog walkers come in, the dogs get walked. Sometimes I have a key, and I'll just go down, and say hello to the dog. And if I got time, of course, I'll just take him for a walk. So, I just think that once again, people are making decisions to bring a dog into their life, and they don't have the lifestyle that allows this. And it's not a good or a bad or a right or a wrong thing. It's more taking a dog into your life is a huge, we call it cradle to grave responsibility.
I like that you said that, cradle to grave, because I'll tell you, as I was talking about a dog that I had back in the 80s, that I got to, and it wasn't that I wanted to give her away. It was a situation where she kept breaking out of the yard. She was a very harmless animal, and one of the neighbors finally got dog control to get a hold of her, and so she went off to dog jail.
Yep.
And I made the decision because it was difficult to give her to someone, and it was a mother and her son, but the last I had heard is that she had ran away, and this was back in the 80s. Of course, she's probably long since passed, but it just, when you do that, I mean, you got to think about giving away your own children, and I still think about it to this day, like what a regret that was.
Yeah.
It's easier to lose a dog when it dies as you own it, I think, and that's not easy either, than it is to give one away. Unless you give it away because there's a really good, solid, concrete reason the dog was dangerous or whatever the case is. But this, I raised her from a puppy, and so it was, so I agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the kind of thing, and every now and again, I'll get some emails or I've given some talks, and I fully understand, where people are coming from. They'll say, oh, but, I mean, in a sense, what they're saying is, a not-so-good home, I don't want to say a bad home, but a not-so-good home is better than no home, or it's better off that, this dog or these dogs got a home even if they're returned. And that's just not so. I mean, dogs who have multiple homes, I'd have to say most of them, maybe not all of them, really don't develop the security and the safety that allows them to express, if you will, their dogness and who they are. And, I mean, I have a story in Canine Confidential about a local woman. I don't know her, thank goodness, but people were talking at the dog park about a woman who used to come there. She hadn't been there for a while, and they're thinking maybe she wasn't able to get another dog. But and a conservative count was that she had rescued, quote, rescued, I put, 8 dogs from local different humane societies. And I want to be really clear, I'm not blaming the Boulder or Longmont or other humane societies. Maybe she got them elsewhere. But the bottom line was that over the course of some years, she had rescued 8 dogs, all of whom were returned.
Wow.
She'd show up either at a dog park or she'd show up somewhere and people would go, oh, that's not Mary. Oh, no, Mary was a problem, blah, 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 blah. So now I have Henry, and Henry was a problem, so now I have Marie, and Marie was a problem, so now I have George. And finally, somebody made a comment, and they made it in a nice way, I heard. I wasn't there, of saying, what are you doing? She said, oh, I love these dogs, and I want to give them a home. And what they said was, well, you're not giving them a home. What you're doing is you're giving them, you're not giving them, what we call a forever home. You're giving them a temporary home, and it doesn't work. And so, I mean, once again, it gets back to the fact of dogs aren't objects. It's not like, well, I'll try this couch, and if I don't like this couch, I'll get this couch. Dogs are sentient, feeling, conscious beings who need to be loved.
Well, and proof of that is look at when a dog actually has puppies. The dog dotes on those just like a mother does a female, a human mother does with their own children. So
I posted yesterday, since I write for Psychology Today, I posted yesterday an essay. It's called the rich and deep emotional lives of dogs in 226 seconds. And most amazing, the most amazing film video I've ever seen. It lasts 3 minutes and 46 seconds, so that's what 3 minutes and 46 seconds, so it's 226 seconds of an injured puppy. It was made by an animal protection and dog rescue group in India, and a puppy got injured. It's got the mother there, the puppy crying, and I encourage everybody in the world to watch it. In under 2 weeks, it's got 23 million hits. And the reason I mention that is because I think the point you just made, David, is that, yes, just look at the strong bond between mother and young.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no doubt there that this is what puppies need. They get it from their mother. They might get it from a male who's around. It depends. But they get it from their mom. And so much of their later behavior hangs on the sort of relationship they had with their mom. You can hear stories of, a mother having a litter, and perhaps she dies or she gets sick and she can't provide the food and the nurturing and the love that they need. And a lot of these puppies come out and they're damaged, and it doesn't mean that it's irreversible, but it really means that if you get a puppy from that situation, that you've got to even give it more TLC.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, what about barking? There's usually a lot of controversy, that dogs, they bark, that could be good, or they do it because they're nervous, excessive barking, things like that.
Well, it's funny. Barking is one of the most common behaviors, dog behaviors: barking, howling, whining, whimpering, and we actually don't know that much about it. It could be an indication of fear and anxiety, but then again, it could be context specific. And the way I usually do it is I look at the situation in which a dog is barking, and then I can make some, hopefully a pretty solid, educated, guess about why they're barking. But it's a great question because, there's all different sorts of barks, and dogs bark a lot. So I say context is key. If it's a situation where you think your dog as an individual feels uneasy, then pay attention to why they're barking and what you can do to, lessen it. But there's been studies showing that dogs who want to play will bark as an attention getter. Alexandra Horowitz did this as part of her PhD dissertation years ago. It's like me yelling, "Hey," I get your attention, and then I can do a play signal, or I can go, "Hey," and make some gesture, to indicate that I want something. I want you to do something. Maybe I want you to play, or I want you to leave. So I know it's hard on some people, especially in the city, but once again, in the mountains, this anecdotal evidence, it'd be interesting to hear if you've ever heard anything like this, but certainly anecdotal evidence was my dogs hardly barked at all, and I think part of it is because they weren't restrained, they weren't caged, and if there was something that bothered them, they knew that they had the flexibility of movement. They could make choices to get out of a certain situation, or, they would bark. I don't know, I used to think my dog Jethro barked to tell his friend Zoe down the road that he was now out in the morning. I swear.
Right.
Yeah, so we still don't know much about barking. That's really the bottom line.
Now, I think I'd like to kind of end the program on unleashing your dog. Obviously, let's talk about the title itself, because this is a question of whether or not Should I be out there, with my dog on the leash? Obviously, in the city, you want to show some restraint, as people tend to be very sensitive. I mean, so again, sometimes you just see people with some of the craziest behaviors, but they're their behaviors. But yeah, when appropriate time, or getting a feel for, because again, as I described the dog that I used to have back in the 80s, I could go walking with her a lot without a leash. And if she started to get a little too far ahead, then I just simply call her name and she'd back off and get a little bit closer. So
Yeah.
She was really good with verbal commands, all very natural. I didn't really have to train her. It was just because we were out in the habit of that, she got used to it. And I think, that's where you see the loyal companion idea. It's sort of like your own kids. Hey, don't go out in the street. Okay, and they and there you go.
Yeah, I agree totally with you. One of the things, when I lived in the mountains outside of Boulder, my dogs were, I would have to say, almost never leashed, and sometimes didn't have a collar, and they learned what they could and could not do. The title of the book was really motivated because so many dogs have leashes or tethers of some sort. And so it was a metaphor to unleash it. If I had to expand it, which of course you can't do in a title, but it's unleash your dog whenever it's safe to do, and let them be a dog. Let them sniff, right. Let them play, let them, do doggy-like things as much as you are able to do, as long as it's safe. So we point out, of course, if you live in the city, you just can't let your dog walk down Main Street or Fifth Avenue unleashed. But you could then find places that if your dog likes a dog park, they could be unleashed. If there's places to run them, where you live, on trails, then unleash them. The other point we make, and I'm glad you asked this, is the dog's walk is for them. So even if they're on a lead, unleashing metaphorically would mean if they want to stop and sniff, then let them stop and sniff. The walk is for them. It's not like you hear or you see people pulling their dogs down the street doing a four-paw skid, but you can unleash a leash dog.
So the idea is just to allow them that freedom and that space to be able to just, as we've been talking about, just be dogs.
Exactly. Once again, learn dog, become dog literate, blah, 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 blah. And then just accept the fact that sometimes they're going to want to sniff a lot and sometimes they're not. So let them sniff. So that's really where it came from. I always say, unleash your dog the most you can so your dog can be a dog. Your dog can do certain things and express, certain emotions. And, I guess I would end just saying that, once again, you bring a dog into your life, it's an enormous cradle to grave responsibility, the cradle being whenever you get them, if they're young or older, and you are really obliged to do all you can to give them the best life possible. You're obliged to learn what each individual needs, and you're also obliged to form what we call these reciprocal relationships where there's mutual tolerance, mutual respect, and that you can't always do what you want to do when you make the choice to live with a dog.
That's for sure.
I mean,
that should be the enjoyable part of it, is being able to enjoy the animal as it's, as they would say, Buddha nature.
That's exactly right. No, yes, that's exactly right. And so I think what you just said really summarizes everything, and the unleashing really is. I've actually had some emails from people which have been really nice, where they went, my dog has to be on a leash. I live in the middle of Manhattan, or I live in the middle of, Dallas. And I go, yes, I understand that, but you can still unleash a leash dog, and this is how you can do it.
Exactly. Again, you got to realize, as the dog's out, especially in a place like Manhattan or in the city, is the dog's on the leash mainly for its own protection, sometimes against how other people are going to react to it. I mean, I've seen some astoundingly stupid behavior out there and people reacting to dogs.
Precisely.
And that's why I say, yeah, reel that dog in. It isn't because you're protecting that person. You're actually protecting your dog from what they might do to the dog. And, you know, like, for instance, just real quickly before we wrap up here, I remember seeing, and this was when I was still living up in the Northwest, there were these two men. They were walking their dogs, and, of course, the dog started barking, getting excited. The next thing you know, the one guy who was crossing to the left, he turned around. He was going to do a roundhouse kick on the other guy's dog.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the kind of thing we're talking about here.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. You know, once again, if you accept the fact that, you know, you've got a dog and you want to give them the best life possible, giving them the best life possible has a lot to do with their feeling safe. And what you just said is just so good, you know, that they will learn that even on a leash they're allowed to exercise their nose, for example, or even on a leash they're allowed to investigate other dogs. So the leash isn't sort of the leash doesn't sort of confine them to like a jail cell. It just means that you care about them, and so unleash them when you can. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it's been wonderful to have you on the program, Mark. You know, and again, we talked a lot about you're not coming on trying to be an expert. This is point A, B, C, and D, and no other way like you tend to see on television or whatever the case is where somebody's selling a product or a service. But basically what we're saying here is go ahead and read this book, dispel a lot of the myths that may be circulating around there about what dogs can and can't do, what they like and don't like, what's good, what's bad, things like that. I think it's like anything in life, especially even for humans. Life is an experiment. We're getting out there and we're living that, and the more that we can allow that freedom to be given, the more often you'll see a dog is just as capable of making good decisions for itself as we are for ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. My next book, you can write the summary.
Sounds good. I'll be up for it. Well, Mark, thank
exactly
you for being on the program. And before you go, why don't you go ahead and give out a website where people can find out how to take a look at your other books, as well as Unleashing Your Dog, things like that.
I think the best place to go would be markbekoff.com. It's markbekoff.com, and there's links there for books, and there's links there for everything. And the other thing I'd like to just tell you, readers, quickly is that I write for Psychology Today regularly, and I've written literally hundreds of essays on dog behavior, dog cognition, dog emotions, basically explaining the latest science to people in a way that they don't roll their eyes and go, oh, my goodness. So you could if you just do a search for Mark Bekoff Psychology Today, you'll come up on my Animal Emotions column.
Well, very good. Again, the book is Unleashing Your Dog, or maybe ours. Why not? Our guest, Mark Bekoff, joining us here on the program. Again, you can visit him at markbekoff.com and find out more about the book. Mark, thank you for being on the program today.
My pleasure. Thank you, and I hope you all have a good rest of the day.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners and dog owners out there in the world, for tuning in and discovering more at Beyond 50. You can also take a little walk to beyond50radio.com, and you don't have to be on a leash to discover more about what we're up to in our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.